I think the greatest achievement of Lincoln is that we still have a United States of America where slavery doesn't exist. I think we have a United States of America that holds out the true promise that all men are created equal, and that we might live up to that one day. The reality is, from 1776, even before, to 1865, if you were born black in this country in a certain region, you were enslaved or could be enslaved. After 1865, that is not the case.
I think understanding Lincoln's rise to power is something that is really key to understanding why there is an American Civil War, because one could argue that Lincoln is a primary reason why there's a war. He's a huge impetus. He's a huge threat.
He seems to be an ambitious person. He grows up and loves to learn. As he's traveling around, he seems to be gregarious. He seems to be a kind of person who easily relates to folks. And one of the things you cannot overlook about Lincoln, it actually gets mythologized quite a bit, is this kind of self-made man, right? And it is really true. He really learns a lot on his own and of his own volition, and we like that. It's this very American story of rising by your own hard work and your own kind of willpower, from one-room cabin to the White House. I do think that Lincoln's birthplace and where he is in terms of the country and its expansion is really important. What ultimately happens with Kansas-Nebraska Act is we're talking about the expansion of the country. Before that was the Mexican War. And so those are issues that we are discussing. We're going to grow. What does that mean as we grow? At the time he's born, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, that's the edge of that frontier. So he has an innate understanding of that. When it comes to the Mexican War in Congress, it's called the Wilmot Proviso, basically a piece of legislation that says that any territory gained by the Mexican War will not allow slavery. Lincoln supports that. He votes for it. He mentions at some point that he thinks he's voted for it some 40-odd times. What Lincoln eventually starts to be concerned about is the idea of nationalizing slavery. He sees that the Missouri Compromise is repealed, and you no longer have a geographic line that's going to stop you from spreading slavery that way. He sees things like the Dred Scott decision, the fugitive slave law. The country is grappling with very difficult issues. These are existential questions about who we are going to be, what our laws mean, what do we value. And I think it's at that point that Lincoln really goes back to the very founding of the country.
Lincoln was extremely practical, and Douglas would try to corner him, and Lincoln was very elusive. And frankly, many times he wouldn't give Douglas a straight answer. But what he was straight on was that the Declaration of Independence was literal. He believed that Thomas Jefferson meant that all men are created equal. And Douglas clearly stated that is not what he believed, nor that was what Thomas Jefferson meant. So each holds their own absolute position. He sees slavery as being something that America can no longer balance, that the country has to be all this or all that. It cannot be this hybrid anymore, which is very interesting, because then when he gets elected president, he has to take the balanced approach.
It's interesting because Douglas's perspective that it wasn't truly meant that all men are created equal has a lot of currency at that time. It's a real debate among some people. See, Alexander Stephens very clearly saying the founders were wrong.
He is focused and fixated on two things throughout 1850. That the United States of America, the Union, was perpetual and could not be broken, and that slavery was wrong. Those two positions within him never changed. The Republican Party was anti-slavery. This wasn't an anti-tax or anti-tariff or anti-states' rights party. This was an anti-slavery party. The Republicans run a full-blown abolitionist in '56 who loses, and so they have to kind of recalibrate and figure out how are they going to win. And here comes Lincoln roaring onto the scene now as a Senate candidate in '58 against Douglas. And he is the perfect candidate. He is the perfect person. He has the perfect logic to rip the whole country apart. And this man, they knew, had made an argument about slavery and what a contagion it had become that was resonating with Northerners. They voted for him resoundingly. They had views that today we would consider racist or bigoted. white supremacist, if you will. But they knew slavery was a problem. Lincoln, coming from where he did, born in Kentucky, living in central Illinois, Lincoln knew that a lot of Northerners were hardscrabble farmers. You know, not everybody lived in a city and was rich and was a resident of Philadelphia, Boston, or New York City. There were a lot of people out there who were struggling to survive. And you know what they didn't have? They didn't have slaves. Lincoln was making an argument about free labor as well, and this appealed to Northerners. And he was hitting them in the not racist part of their psyche. To a 20, 25-year-old man in the mid to late 1850s, it's all they'd heard their whole life, was Southerners talking about their rights. Meanwhile, this guy in Wisconsin, Iowa, cutting down trees, trying to farm 50 acres, doesn't even understand the argument, but he does understand one thing. He's sick of hearing about it. And here comes the rail splitter from Illinois, who seems to represent them.
He's presenting a point of view that essentially says slavery can exist where it does. It just shouldn't expand. And I think that seems reasonable to a great many people in 1860.
I think Lincoln knew by the time he was inaugurated there wouldn't be a balance, because by that point 7 states have seceded. They seceded because they rightfully saw the writing on the wall. Here was someone at the head of a party that was not going to let them do whatever they wanted. This is the culmination of, for many of them, 20 or 30 years of what they considered agitation. But let's be clear, this isn't agitation about taxes or tariffs. The Morrill Tariff was passed by Congress and signed into law by James Buchanan, not Abraham Lincoln. And the Morrill Tariff, which was a higher percentage on largely British or European imports, was only passed because Southern senators had left the Senate. If they ever talked about taxes, it was about taxes on slaves. This was agitation over Negro slavery, over African slavery, over the Fugitive Slave Act. Having made the threat, Southern honor simply could not allow them to backtrack. And what they see is control slipping away. Because of course, what was their goal? It wasn't just to expand slavery. Their goal was to expand slavery into Cuba and into South America, and to develop a slaveocracy in the Western Hemisphere, to be perpetual. And let's be perfectly honest, Lincoln was so hated and so despised that he was assassinated. This goes beyond, I would argue, what's happened to any president with the exception maybe of JFK. There was a visceral kind of hatred of this man.
Lincoln's evolution of thought is fascinating too. You really go from that 1854 perspective, and you think about the fact that it's 1863, all of a sudden the Emancipation Proclamation there, even though it's an act of war, even though it's in the midst of that, henceforth and forever free within 10 years.
Horace Greeley is excoriating Lincoln for his policy, because Lincoln hasn't made any moves on slavery. Lincoln said at that point, if he could save the country by freeing all the slaves, he'd do that. If he could save the country by freeing none of the slaves, he'd do that. My paramount object, he said, is to preserve the Union. Seems pretty straightforward, right? It's what he'd been saying really since the beginning of the war. Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer and a consummate politician. When he sat in the Oval Office and wrote those words, he had already presented a preliminary copy of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. And about 3 weeks later, he dropped the bomb that reshaped the American Civil War. And at that moment, Southerners were right. Lincoln was the greatest threat to slavery, to their power, to their money, to their grip on America's future. They were right. They had properly gauged that Abraham Lincoln was not talking about taxes and tariffs. Lincoln was talking about saving the country and ending slavery so we could live up to the promise of the founding and we could go forward.
Let's just put all things aside and ask for a second what was decided with the Civil War. And no matter the causes, no matter what you think about Lincoln, by the end of the war, this country no longer has slavery. The reality is all the men who died in this war died so that our country can come closer to its founding promise. The Gettysburg Address, these men would not have died in vain. Lincoln realizes if we fight this war and there's still slavery at the end of the war, that we failed in some way.
When he went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just months after the battle, when the air was still filled with the smell of death, in 2 minutes, he made history. And he talked about the sacrifice. And here's a hard truth. He talked about these men had consecrated the ground far greater than we can. He was talking about the U.S. debt. He wasn't talking about both sides. He wasn't taking any shots at the other side, and I think Lincoln would have openly admitted, I understand why those Southern boys and those Southern men and those Southern women feel the way that they do. But when he went to Gettysburg, he was talking about U.S. debt. He was talking about men who he probably knew even if he didn't know any of them personally. He knew who they were. He knew their awful racial tendencies, their selfishness. But he knew they had died for something bigger. They died to save the country and to end slavery. That's 11 months after the proclamation and 11 months before his re-election as president. So for all those who would say Northerners were racist too and they were bad, yeah, and they elected Lincoln twice. And they put hundreds of thousands of men in the field who gave willingly of themselves to save the country and free people that they didn't either know, had never met, in many instances didn't even care for. Lincoln understood that. He understood the inherent decency of Americans. And then he was gone. And then he did become a martyr, and he became a myth. And he became something that you can hardly even touch. But if you go to Springfield and you go to the memorial and you just stop being emotional about it and thinking that it's all because he hated the Confederacy, which he didn't. He thought Dixie was a great song. He understood, I think, Confederate soldiers better than a lot of Confederate sympathizers do today. He understood they were flawed Americans. But slavery had to end. And slavery just wasn't the natural condition of any man. That's his legacy.